Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into a fascinating text that makes a very direct and honestly pretty provocative connection between modern pop culture trends and ancient spiritual warfare. Seriously, regardless of your own theological background, it's absolutely fascinating to see how the author of this source material constructs this framework. They literally bridge ancient biblical warnings right to the entertainment landscape we see on our screens every single day. So we're going to trace the author's logic step by step, straight from the source material, to figure out exactly how they reach their ultimate, quite intense conclusion. Let's get into it. Here's our roadmap for today. We've got 4 key areas to hit. First up, the spiritual hierarchy. Then, ancient idolatry as adultery. From there, we'll look at the modern entertainment parallel. And finally, we'll wrap up with what the author calls the ultimate spiritual deception.
All right, starting with part 1, the spiritual hierarchy. Defining the divine order of creation.
Right off the bat, notice how the source sets up this really rigid core binary. According to the text, God established a fundamental principle at the very beginning of creation: the spiritual realm is strictly masculine and the earthly realm is inherently feminine. The author argues that humanity was actually designed to perfectly mirror this exact relationship. So in their framework, men represent the spiritual realm and women represent the earthly realm. To back this up, the author points to this verse from the Apostle Paul. The text interprets this scripture to argue that the spiritual, and therefore in this specific framework, the masculine, carries an inherent divine authority. Basically, the argument here is that anytime this specific, spiritual to earthly, masculine to feminine hierarchy gets inverted or messed with, it results in what the author bluntly terms spiritual perversion.
So what does this corruption actually look like? Well, here is the crucial point. If spirit equals male and earth equals feminine, then an earthly spirit is a direct, literal contradiction of the divine order. An earthly spirit, therefore, manifests as a feminine male, a being embodying the feminine principle, but within a masculine form. And drawing on the book of Ephesians, the source actually takes us a massive step further. They claim that fallen, earthly spirits are quite literally what Scripture defines as demons. So the ultimate conclusion here is that feminine males in the physical world represent a demonic principle made manifest in human form. Pretty heavy stuff, right?
Moving right along to part 2, ancient idolatry as adultery, the biblical precedent of betrayal.
Now, to really grasp the gravity of the author's claims, we have to look at how they frame idolatry. The text argues that ancient idols were never just, statues made of wood or stone. Instead, the prophets of Israel repeatedly use this metaphor of spiritual adultery. In this metaphor, God is framed as the betrayed husband, and Israel is the unfaithful wife. The idols, therefore, were actual stand-ins for spiritual beings. They were acting as false lovers to actively entice God's people away.
Using the prophet Jeremiah, the author establishes that turning away from that godly masculine ideal we talked about earlier to worship these idols is explicitly equated to spiritual prostitution. The text really emphasizes that the allure of these false gods wasn't just some simple mistaken religious practice. No, it was a deeply intimate betrayal. It was a literal cheating on the divine order that God had established.
And the author points to some extremely intense biblical examples to show the frankly terrifying fanatical devotion these false gods commanded from their followers. The text cites Jeremiah and Ezekiel, recounting how ancient followers built high places for Baal and even committed the ultimate abomination, sacrificing their own children to gods like Molech. I mean, the source uses this dark history to illustrate just how deeply and destructively these inverted spiritual forces can captivate human hearts, leading people to defend and serve their false idols at absolutely any cost.
Which brings us to a really fascinating pivot point in this explainer. Okay, we've got the author's framework for the spiritual hierarchy, right? And we've got their historical context for idolatry. But how exactly does the source bridge this ancient, bloody idolatry to today's entertainment landscape? Let's take a look.
That brings us to part 3, the modern entertainment parallel, idols, fans, and inverted dynamics. Notice the super direct comparison the author makes here. Just as Israel's prophets condemned the worship of weak gods who literally needed humans to carry them around, the source argues that modern fans display the exact same behavior today. They argue that fans blindly prop up fragile entertainers who exhibit weakness, fragility, and moral failings rather than embodying strong spiritual leadership. It's like a giant puzzle coming together for the author. Using Isaiah's mockery of powerless idols, the text argues that modern fans display a completely inverted dynamic. Think about it. Isaiah points out how foolish it is to worship a statue that has to be carried and can't even answer a cry for help.
The author links this directly to modern entertainment, suggesting that fans today will viciously defend their favorite entertainers even when evidence of heinous behavior is overwhelmingly obvious. In the author's view, it's an exact mirror of ancient idolatry. The weaker entity receives absolute devotion from the stronger one. And here's the kicker. The source claims this isn't merely some passing aesthetic trend in fashion or music. No, they say it's a deliberate spiritual strategy. By normalizing the feminine male, the author argues, the culture is deliberately neutralizing the godly masculine ideal, which the text states is represented by Christ. It essentially satisfies what the Apostle Paul called itching ears by providing this diluted, non-threatening version of masculinity that completely lacks any divine power or spiritual authority.
Which leads us to our final section, Part 4, the ultimate spiritual deception, the prophetic warning for humanity. Now, the author outlines a remarkably specific progression here. Step 1 is the cultural conditioning we are supposedly seeing right now, the normalization of the feminine male archetype. This leads directly into Step 2, a psychological and spiritual softening to inverted spiritual principles. And all of this, the text claims, culminates in Step 3, paving the way for the acceptance of the ultimate deception, the Antichrist. The author is literally arguing that today's cultural conditioning is actively, purposefully preparing the entire world to embrace a very specific type of charismatic leader.
Based on this scripture from 2 Thessalonians, the source asserts that the Antichrist will likely embody this exact feminine male archetype, because the world is already being conditioned to obsess over and idolize the specific blend of beguiling, non-threatening, inverted masculinity. The text argues that the lawless one will utilize this very persona. Why? To effectively draw worship away from God and onto himself. The text concludes by urging readers to view these entertainment trends not as harmless fun or just passing fads, but as an active spiritual battle demanding intense biblical discernment. Drawing on 1 Thessalonians, the author leaves the reader with a really strict call to vigilance. Test everything. According to the source, the hearts and minds of humanity are currently on the front lines of this ancient war, completely masked by modern pop culture.
So, as we wrap up this explainer today, consider this provocative question. Think about how the author's theological framework might totally change the way you analyze the media you consume every single day. I mean, if the source material is correct in its assertion that aesthetics and fandoms are actually vectors for spiritual conditioning, well, it completely shifts the lens through which we view our screens, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this complex and fascinating text. Keep asking questions, keep looking deeper, and I'll see you next time.